Coming to paperback and e-readers from the author of the critically acclaimed book The Man Crisis comes The Woman Crisis. Learn why so many women are becoming lost in their quest to have it all in The Woman Crisis. Pre-order your copy of The Woman Crisis on Amazon.com today. One of my viewers wanted me to do another installment in the Historical Women in Crisis series. And for this installment in the Historical Women in Crisis series, I'm going to be talking about two predatory women who wound up taking the lives of their simp husbands, and how these two women who went out here and participated in these murder schemes wound up becoming women in crisis. Now, these two women in crisis I'm going to be talking about are Brynn Hartman and Kimberly Renee Poole. Now, your Brynn Hartman was the wife of the late comedian Phil Hartman, who was known for being on the show Saturday Night Live, also known for doing voiceovers on shows like The Simpsons as Troy McClure, and was later known for being on the show News Radio on NBC, and had also done other feature films such as House Guest. And it was that success that led to all of the envy that his wife, Brynn Hartman, had, because your Brynn Hartman coveted the success that Phil Hartman was having, and that was her motive for murdering her husband, because he had all of the success that she wanted to have in a career, and because he was out here living the life that she wanted to live. This is why she wanted to take his life. Now, your Brynn Hartman was not born the Brynn at all. Her real name was Vicky Jo Almadal, and she was born in River Falls, Minnesota, and she went out here and married a man, Douglas Ivor Torfin, who was a phone operator. However, she wound up divorcing that man, and I believe she wound up divorcing that man due to hypergamy, because she wanted to have the high-value life that she possibly saw in the entertainment industry. Now, your Vicky Jo Almadal wound up meeting Phil Hartman in 1986 on a blind date, and I believe your Vicky Jo Almadal basically fell in love not with Phil Hartman, but with the fact that he was an up-and-coming entertainer, and she wanted to go out here and monkey branch to this man because she saw the success he was having, and she also wanted to create a covert contract with him where if he became a star, he would find a way to make her a star as well. Now, after marrying Phil Hartman, they had two children, and your Vicky Jo Almadal, who changed her name to Brynn Hartman, after having her two kids, was out here working as a Catalina swimsuit model and was hoping to use this as a springboard into a career. And your Phil Hartman, who was at the rising to the highest point of his career, coming off of Saturday Night Live and being known on The Simpsons as Troy McClure and other voiceover roles, was starting to branch out into other types of content, like the show guest on Third Rock from the Sun, I believe, and his regular stint on News Radio. And as your Phil Hartman was out here at the rising at the height of his popularity, he was out here starring in feature films, and he was well on his way to becoming an A-list star. And this is one of the things that I believe it led to your Brynn being so jealous, because she wanted to have that fame and success for herself, and she wanted to have that attention for herself. And this is what led to her becoming so insecure that she wound up becoming depressed. And as she became depressed, she began going out here and taking antidepressants. And one of these antidepressants, when mixed with alcohol, would lead to her going into rages. Now, as your Brynn was going into rages, your Phil Hartman was becoming more of a beta male. And as he became more of a beta male, he would try to avoid his wife by going and hiding from her. And he wanted to try to make this marriage work, not understanding there was no way of making a marriage work with a predatory female like a Brynn Hartman, who basically was using Phil Hartman as a tool to elevate her own career and elevate herself through him and try to get success at his expense. Unfortunately, in the case of your Brynn Hartman, she never got that success, and as she saw her husband going out here and getting all of this success to the point where he was starting to star in feature films, that's when her jealousy turned to envy and her envy turned to rage. Now, some people want to say it was the drugs that was triggering her anger because she was mixing the antidepressant with alcohol and was back on cocaine after spending some time with Andy Dick. But I don't believe that it was just the drugs. I believe that your Brynn Hartman had deep-seated anger towards your Phil Hartman, and this was her motive for murder because in 1998, Phil Hartman was at the peak of his success and on his way to becoming an A-list movie star because he had starred in several movies and in supporting roles, and it was just a matter of time before Phil could have gotten that lead role that would have led to him becoming a superstar on the level of Will Smith because his comic timing was that good, and that's what it made your Brynn Hartman extremely enraged because she saw her husband having the success that she wanted to have, and since the covert contract she created with Phil Hartman wasn't fulfilled to her terms, she wanted to go out here and make Phil Hartman pay for not fulfilling the terms of the covert contract she created with him. And this is why she wound up taking out a firearm and winding up murdering Phil Hartman as he was hiding away from her after one of their arguments. And this is what led to her winding up taking the life of her husband. And after taking the life of her husband, she then contacted a neighbor and told them what she did. And once the neighbor saw the body of Phil Hartman, he then called the police, and they got the kids out of the house, where your Brynn Hartman then wound up committing suicide because at that point she basically knew she wasn't going to have the fame that she wanted. No, she would have gone out in infamy, and instead of being held accountable for the crime that she committed, what she did was look to end her life because she would go out not in fame like she wanted to, but she would go out in infamy like Norma Desmond in Sunset Boulevard, and she was possibly fearing having to spend the rest of her life in a penitentiary with your Big Betty, Bertha, and Maxine. So she wanted to avoid having to spend the rest of her life playing spades for Little Debbie snack cakes, ramen noodles, Kit Kat candy bars, honey buns, and other assorted commissary items. So this is why she went out here and took her life. But your Brynn Hartman was a woman in crisis even before she even came to Hollywood, because your Brynn Hartman basically was a gold digger, and she wasn't satisfied with being married to a phone operator. No, she wanted to be a big-time Hollywood star, and that's why she wound up taking the life of her husband, because since she couldn't have fame, she wanted to get revenge on the man who she thought was preventing her from having fame. But the problem was she's probably just another average-looking actress, and blondes are a dime a dozen, and if you don't have any talent, there's no reason for anybody to go out here and hire you. So this was what was holding back your Brynn Hartman, who wanted to go out here and take out all of her anger about her failed career on Phil Hartman. But it really wasn't Phil Hartman's fault that Brynn wasn't a star. I mean, at that time in the 90s, there were just so many blondes out there. And again, these women were a dime a dozen. But because your Brynn Hartman was in her feelings about the failure of her career, she couldn't see that she was up against stiff competition and she wasn't going to go out here and be a star on her own. And sadly, I guess your Phil Hartman was too much of a simp to tell her that you don't have the skills to be the star that you want, because he was running and hiding from her when maybe he should have done what the first husband did and send her on her way, because that possibly could have saved his life. But instead he tried to stay with this woman who became a woman in crisis when she took his life. Now, the other woman that my viewer wanted me to talk about was your Kimberly Renee Poole. Now, your Kimberly Renee Poole went out here and had her husband, William Brent Poole, murdered back in 1998 because she wanted to get custody of their child, and she also wanted to get access to all of William Brent Poole's resources. Now, Kimberly Renee Poole was living a double life. She was a housewife by day, and she was a stripper by night. And she was somebody that most men would avoid because, like I talk about in my book, Misadventures of Captain Save-'em, a stripper by nature is a predator, and she looks to go out here and prey on gullible, naive men, and that's basically what your William Brent Poole was, because he was a simp for sitting out here and getting involved with this woman, not understanding that many of these strippers basically are women who look to use men as tools to move themselves from point A to point B. Now, your William Brent Poole was he was a simp who was devoted to his wife and practically looked to give her everything, but that wasn't enough for her. No, she wanted more than that. She craved jewelry, designer clothing, and would even go out here and have affairs on your Brent Poole in order to go out here and get what she actually wanted. So what your Kimberly Poole was doing was what most strippers do when they're at the strip bar. The tips just aren't enough money from the marks or the patrons. So what they do is start going out here and having affairs with the guys who they are patrons of the club. And a lot of these women, usually they're dropping the skid mark G-string at after hours at the club and meeting up with these guys for encounters and having these guys go out here and buy them stuff. And all the while, the simp that they're married to are thinking that, oh, this girl is just a respectable girl. She's just out here dancing because she wants to make a few extra dollars. But there are a lot of times these women, again, they are just, again, using men as tools. And that's what Kimberly Renee Poole was doing with these guys. And she had gotten involved with another man, John Boyd Fraser, a patron at the club where she worked. And she went out here, whispered sweet nothings into your John Boyd Fraser's ear, told him a BS story about how this husband of hers wasn't paying the bills, how this husband wasn't taking care of the family, how this husband wasn't responsible. And then after she put a battery in your John Boyd Fraser's back, she then told him about a plan to go out here and murder her husband. And on June 9th, 1998, as your Kimberly Renee Poole and her husband were out here celebrating their third anniversary, your Poole went out here and lured him to an oceanfront hotel. And while they were having sex on the beach, then this man, John Boyd Fraser, ran up on them, made it look like it was a robbery, and then wound up shooting your William Brent Poole dead. And what your Kimberly and Renee Poole wanted to make it look like was a robbery, and wanted to make it look like a robbery so that she could go out here and get your Brent Poole's insurance, get Brent Poole's pension, get Brent Poole's money, get Brent Poole's house, get everything that he had. And she was going to possibly get away with doing this before she eventually wound up getting flipped on by someone, and eventually the entire case wound up in court, and your Kimberly Renee Poole wound up getting arrested. She wound up getting put on trial, and she wound up being convicted of first-degree murder for the murder of her husband, because this gold digger, while she thought she could go out here and dig for gold, she didn't understand how she basically undermined herself with this scheme. So she wanted to try to make it look like, oh, this marriage was rocky, but how was the marriage rocky when she was a simp who would give her everything? But the problem was she wanted more than what this man could give her, and she wanted to go out here and try to find a way to get everything for herself, but wound up with absolutely nothing at the end of the day, because when it comes down to many of these gold diggers, they go out here sometimes digging for gold and then it winds up blowing up in their face, because their greed winds up making them into their own worst enemy. And as a result of your Kimberly Renee Poole plotting to murder her husband, what happened to her was she wound up with a life sentence. And now, instead of her living the good life and with all of the finer things in life, she's basically in prison for the rest of her life, working for 10 cents an hour and hoping for the finer things in the commissary, like the Little Debbie snack cakes, ramen noodles, cups of coffee, Kit Kat candy bars, and possibly hopes to get a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle pie or some six-pack Oreo cookies when she's playing spades with Betty, Big Bertha, and Magic Martha. So that's what happened to her because of her greed. But in both the cases of your Brynn Hartman and Kimberly Renee Poole, both of these women basically were gold diggers who became women in crisis, because one, your Brynn Hartman, basically was following everything I said in my book, The Woman Crisis, about feminists being competitors to their men. And when her man became more successful than she was, she got so enraged she murdered her husband, because she couldn't stand the fact that a man had more success than she did. And in the case of your Kimberly Renee Poole, she was so greedy for success that she didn't value her husband. She didn't see him as a man, and she didn't see him as a man she needed to respect. And because she didn't see him as a man she needed to respect, she used him as a tool, and she looked to break the tool when she was finished. Same thing with Brynn Hartman. When the tool, Phil Hartman, was no longer of use to her, she wanted to break the tool, because she didn't want anybody else to be able to use the tool, and she didn't want anybody else to know her real nature. That's what a lot of these women do, because they want to keep their world smooth. So what they look to do is eliminate the men so that they can't tell about any of the skeleton bones that remain behind as related to them. So if they're doing dirt, what they want to do is keep that dirt covered, and that's what your Kimberly Renee Poole and Brynn Hartman did. But as they went and did this, they became women in crisis, and these women in crisis wound up with their lives forever changed, because they just were so greedy for what they wanted that they wound up with nothing at the end of their lives. Now, this was a requested video from a viewer as related to the historical Women in Crisis series. And if you want to request a historical Women in Crisis video, you can request one by dropping a donation to the Cash App or the PayPal by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to learn what motivates women to become women in crisis, like the ones I'm talking about in this video, you can pick up my book, The Woman Crisis, on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find The Woman Crisis on Smashwords, the iBook store, and Google Play. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and Kindle, All About Marilyn. Learn all about the struggles of a faded former teen sitcom star in this absolutely fabulous 5-star screenplay. Get All About Marilyn in paperback and Kindle on Amazon.com today.